In 1842, the United States declared the Second Seminole War over. The declaration sounded final. It suggested that a costly campaign had reached its conclusion, that Washington could close the books, reduce expenses, and move on. But in Florida, the word peace did not mean what officials wanted it to mean. It did not mean the Seminoles were gone. It did not mean the wetlands had been mastered. It did not mean the long struggle that began in the War of 1812's southern borderlands had finally ended. It meant the United States was tired. Many Seminoles had been removed west. Many had died. Families had been shattered by battle, hunger, disease, capture, negotiation, betrayal, and forced migration. Black Seminole communities had been pulled into disputes over freedom, slavery, military service, and removal. The war had consumed money and lives far beyond what American leaders expected. Yet a smaller Seminole population remained in Florida. That survival mattered. It turned the official ending into an uneasy compromise. The United States had not achieved complete removal. It had forced many people out, but it had not erased Seminole presence from the peninsula. In the Everglades, Big Cypress, and the remote southern interior, families continued to live beyond the clean lines of federal maps. Episode 5 begins in that uneasy silence after 1842. It follows the years when the government tried to turn exhaustion into policy, when remaining Seminoles tried to preserve distance and dignity, and when the pressure for land slowly rebuilt toward another war. The War of 1812 had ended decades earlier, but its consequences still moved through Florida water. The Seminoles who remained in Florida did not survive by accident. They survived through knowledge, movement, caution, and community. The wetlands were not empty hiding places. They were homelands of water, islands, hammocks, trails, animals, plants, seasonal roots, and memory. Outsiders often saw only swamp and confusion. Seminole families saw a living geography that could feed them, shelter them, and warn them. Leaders such as Abiaka, remembered by many Americans as Sam Jones, embodied this endurance. Older, elusive, and rooted in the southern country, he represented a form of resistance that did not depend on winning formal battles. Avoiding capture, maintaining community, and refusing removal could be forms of victory when the enemy's goal was disappearance. Other leaders, including Billy Bowlegs, would become central in the next phase. Bowlegs had survived the earlier war and understood the danger of open confrontation. The balance was delicate. Too much contact invited pressure. Too much isolation made trade and diplomacy difficult. Every meeting with American officials carried the shadow of earlier broken promises. For Seminole families, the years after 1842 were not peaceful in the ordinary sense. They were watchful. Soldiers remained in Florida. Settlers kept arriving. Surveyors and speculators looked at land that had once been dismissed as useless and began imagining profit. Each new road, fort, and claim narrowed the space in which Seminole autonomy could breathe. The United States wanted certainty. The Seminoles wanted room. Those two desires could not easily coexist. Far from Florida, removed Seminoles and other southeastern native peoples faced another struggle: rebuilding after forced migration. Indian Territory was not a blank refuge waiting peacefully beyond the Mississippi. It was a place where removed nations had to reconstruct governments, farms, towns, families, alliances, and political authority under painful conditions. The Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Cherokee, and Seminole peoples each carried different experiences of removal, factional conflict, and loss. Old divisions traveled west with them. For Seminoles removed from Florida, the western future was especially complicated. They entered a region shaped by Creek political influence, federal supervision, and the unresolved status of Black Seminoles. Some Black Seminoles had fought beside Seminoles in Florida. Some had been removed west under promises or understandings that did not always protect them. Slaveholders continued to press claims. Freedom remained contested even after exile. The map made removal look simple. People moved from east to west. The human reality was not simple. Removal broke old places, but did not automatically create stable new ones. Families searched for relatives. Leaders negotiated with federal agents. Communities tried to plant crops and rebuild houses, while memories of Florida remained raw. Some people adapted with extraordinary resilience. Others found the Western settlement another landscape of pressure. This Western story belongs inside the finale because the Indian Wars were never only about battlefields. They were also about what happened afterward, the struggle to remain a people after the government had tried to move the people somewhere else. Removal was not the end of history. It was another beginning forced by power. No part of this story can be understood without Black Seminoles. From the era of Spanish Florida through the Seminole Wars, Black Seminole communities had stood at the dangerous meeting point of native sovereignty and Black freedom. Some were descendants of people who escaped slavery. Some lived in alliance with Seminole towns. Some paid tribute. Some fought, farmed, scouted, translated, negotiated, and protected families. Their existence challenged the slaveholding South's belief that no Black community could remain armed, mobile, and allied beyond plantation control. After removal, the danger did not vanish. In the West, Black Seminoles faced renewed claims from slaveholders and political pressure from officials who did not always treat freedom as settled. Some eventually moved again, including groups who crossed toward Mexico, where the politics of slavery and freedom took a different shape. Others served as scouts in later border conflicts, carrying skills forged in Florida into new landscapes of danger. This was one of the cruel patterns of the era. A people could survive one displacement and still face another. They could win moments of freedom and still have that freedom questioned by men with documents, debts, guns, or political influence. Black Seminole history therefore widens the meaning of the War of 1812's aftermath. The United States did not simply expand across land, it expanded a system of control. In Florida, that system targeted native autonomy and Black refuge together. In the West, the same questions followed. Who could be free, who could claim protection, and whose testimony would the law believe? The final episode has to hold that truth clearly. Survival was not only Seminole survival in Florida, it was also Black Seminole survival across borders. During the 1840s, Florida changed around the people who remained. Statehood came in 1845. That mattered because statehood increased pressure for land, roads, plantations, security, and political control. Florida was no longer a distant territory at the edge of the Republic. It was a state whose white citizens expected the federal government to remove what they saw as obstacles to settlement. Officials in Washington still preferred removal. The smaller Seminole population left in Florida was tolerated only because the previous war had become so expensive and difficult. But toleration is not the same as respect. Federal policy continued to assume that native presence in Florida was temporary. Seminole leaders understood the danger. They knew that peace depended on distance and that distance was shrinking. Traders, soldiers, surveyors, and settlers carried news, goods, rumors, and threats. A single misunderstanding could become a crisis. A single violent encounter could become an argument for renewed removal. The United States often framed the issue as security. Settlers wanted assurance that farms and roads would be safe. Officials wanted stable jurisdiction. But from the Seminole perspective, security meant something different. Protection from removal, protection from fraud, protection from military pressure, and protection from the slow invasion of everyday life. These competing definitions of security made another conflict increasingly possible. The frontier looked quiet. Underneath, it was tightening. Billy Bowlegs became the most visible Seminole leader in the years after the Second Seminole War. To Americans, he was often treated as the man whose choices might decide whether Florida remained peaceful. To Seminoles, his position was more complex. Leadership meant guarding people who had survived decades of war. It meant weighing negotiation against suspicion, trade against exposure, and patience against the risk that patience would be mistaken for weakness. Bowlegs did not seek a grand war in the way American newspapers sometimes imagined native leaders as naturally warlike. He lived in a world where US power surrounded his people. War could bring devastation, but submission could bring removal. Between those dangers, a leader had to move carefully. The US Army also watched him carefully. Officers wanted to prevent violence, but also wanted final removal. Federal agents tried persuasion, gifts, pressure, and negotiation. Sometimes they promised that remaining Seminoles could stay if they remained peaceful. At other times, officials treated their presence as a problem that still required a final answer. That inconsistency was itself destabilizing. When a government speaks peace while preparing coercion, every promise becomes suspect. Bowlegs inherited not only land and leadership, he inherited memory. Payne's Landing, Osceola's capture, Okeechobee, removals, camps, hunger, and the knowledge that official assurances could become traps. The Third Seminole War did not begin with a grand invasion. It grew from pressure, land hunger, and the physical marking of space. In 1855, a U.S. surveying party moved into Seminole territory in southwest Florida. The work of surveyors can look harmless on paper: lines, notes, stakes, measurements, charts. But in the history of expansion, survey lines often came before roads, claims, sales, and settlement. To the people already living there, a survey could look like the first step toward dispossession. The crisis sharpened when members of the surveying party damaged property associated with Billy Bowlegs, including banana plants. To outsiders, the detail could sound small. In context, it was not small. It symbolized intrusion into a space that remaining Seminoles had preserved through decades of struggle. Bowlegs and his followers struck back. The attack in December 1855 opened what became known as the Third Seminole War. Once again, Florida became a military theater. Once again, U.S. troops entered country they did not fully understand. Once again, the goal was removal. And once again, Seminole fighters used mobility, landscape, and survival knowledge against a stronger conventional power. The war began with damaged plants and survey lines, but underneath stood 40 years of memory. The Third Seminole War was smaller than the Second, but it carried the same unresolved question. Could the United States force the last major Seminole communities out of Florida? U.S. forces built posts, launched patrols, burned settlements, destroyed crops, seized supplies, and tried to make continued resistance impossible. Soldiers marched through heat, water, insects, disease, and frustration. The landscape still resisted easy occupation. The old lesson remained. Controlling a fort was not the same as controlling the Everglades. Seminole fighters avoided battles that favored the army. They struck when useful, moved when necessary, and protected families as best they could. Their goal was not to conquer the United States. It was to remain. That difference mattered. American commanders often sought decisive action. Seminole strategy often sought endurance. When one side wants a battle and the other side wants survival, war becomes a contest over time, food, movement, and exhaustion. By the 1850s, the United States was stronger than ever. It had won the Mexican-American War, stretched to the Pacific, and added new territories. Yet in southern Florida, a small native community could still deny the government the clean ending it wanted. That was the remarkable fact. Not that the war was large, that it was still happening at all. The Third Seminole War ended through pressure, negotiation, payments, removals, and fatigue. In 1858, Billy Bowlegs and a number of Seminoles agreed to leave Florida for the West. The departure was not a simple surrender scene. It came after years of military pressure and after federal officials used money and negotiation to accomplish what campaigns alone had not fully achieved. Bowlegs' removal marked the end of the last major armed Seminole conflict in Florida. But once again, the word end requires care. Many Seminoles left, yet not all did. A small population remained in Florida, living in the southern wetlands beyond the reach of complete removal. This pattern repeated the deeper truth of the entire series. The United States could win power, seize land, force treaties, build roads, and remove thousands. It could change the map dramatically, but it could not fully control memory, identity, or survival. For the removed, the West brought new challenges. For those who remained, Florida demanded continued caution. For federal officials, the Seminole problem had been reduced but not erased. For the future Seminole people of Florida, endurance became foundation. The war ended as so many Indian wars ended, not with justice, not with mutual understanding, but with exhaustion and imbalance. Still, survival endured. Removed southeastern nations rebuilt in Indian territory under enormous pressure. They created governments, schools, farms, towns, newspapers, laws, and institutions. They also carried trauma, factional divisions, debates over slavery, conflicts with federal agents, and tensions with neighboring peoples. Removal did not freeze native nations in defeat. It forced them into new political worlds where adaptation itself became survival. The Cherokee Nation had to live with the divisions created by the Treaty of New Echota and the Trail of Tears. The Creek Nation faced its own wounds from coercion, civil conflict, and removal. Choctaw and Chickasaw communities rebuilt after earlier forced migration. Seminoles in the West negotiated their relationship with Creek authority and federal power. These stories complicate any simple ending. The United States often spoke as if removal solved a problem. In reality, removal relocated problems and created new ones. The West became a place of rebuilding, but also a place where federal promises could again shift under pressure. The question of slavery also followed. Some removed native nations included slaveholders. Black Seminoles and freed people lived inside legal and political systems that could be unstable and contested. The sectional crisis growing inside the United States did not stop at the boundary of Indian Territory. By the late 1850s, the nation that had fought the War of 1812 was moving toward a different war with itself. The consequences of expansion were coming home. The War of 1812 helped teach the United States how to imagine itself as a continental power. It survived Britain, it celebrated New Orleans, it watched Tecumseh's Confederacy fall, it broke Creek power at Horseshoe Bend. It pressured Spain out of Florida, it turned borderland conflict into arguments for security and expansion. Then, over the next decades, the same pattern repeated across treaties, roads, surveys, removals, and wars. By the 1850s, the United States had reached the Pacific after the Mexican-American War. It had added enormous western territories. It had grown richer and larger. But expansion did not produce harmony. It produced the question that would split the country. Would slavery expand too? The Indian Wars and removal are part of that story because the Cotton South depended on land. Land hunger pushed native nations aside. Slavery made that hunger more aggressive. Political power followed population, plantations, and new states. The struggle over native homelands and the struggle over slavery were not identical, but they were deeply connected in the Southeast. Florida showed the connection clearly. Seminole resistance threatened land expansion, and the slave system's claim that no refuge could exist beyond its reach. Black Seminole freedom made the issue impossible to reduce to maps alone. Expansion promised opportunity to some Americans. To others, it meant soldiers at the door. Nations remember wars in ways that serve the present. The War of 1812 became, for many Americans, a story of national survival and pride. New Orleans became the triumphant ending. Andrew Jackson became a symbol of decisive leadership. The phrase Second War of Independence turned a messy conflict into a cleaner patriotic memory. But this series has followed the story beyond the clean memory. It has followed Tecumseh and the collapse of native resistance in the Old Northwest. It has followed Fort Mims, Horseshoe Bend, and the Creek catastrophe. It has followed Ghent, New Orleans, and the myth that victory solved the war. It has followed Prospect Bluff, Foultown, Jackson in Florida, Indian removal, the Trail of Tears, Osceola, Okeechobee, Coacoochee, Abiaka, Billy Bowlegs, and the people who remained. That longer memory is harder. It does not deny American courage. Soldiers fought bravely, communities endured invasion, leaders made difficult choices, but it refuses to let courage erase consequence. A republic can defend itself and still become an empire to the people in its path. A battlefield victory can be real and still lead to policies that break homes, nations, and promises. History becomes more useful when it becomes less comfortable. The final memory of this series should not be only a flag over a battlefield. It should also be a fire kept alive in the wetlands. The most important fact at the end of this story is simple. Seminole people remained in Florida. After 3 Seminole Wars, after removal treaties, after soldiers, forts, patrols, burned crops, destroyed towns, captured leaders, Western exile and political pressure, they remained. Their numbers were smaller, their lives were constrained, the costs had been terrible, but survival itself became a historical verdict against the idea that removal had been complete. Over time, the descendants of those who remained would build new forms of community and political identity. The modern Seminole and Miccosukee presence in Florida belongs to a much longer story of endurance, adaptation, and sovereignty. This episode cannot tell all of that later history, but it can close by recognizing that the 19th century wars did not end with disappearance. For Black Seminole descendants, the story also continued across borders, in Indian Territory, Mexico, Texas, and beyond. Their history reminds us that freedom struggles often move through places that official maps treat as margins. The United States grew larger, but the people it tried to remove did not simply vanish into that growth. They carried memory forward. The War of 1812. Indian Wars series began with sailors impressed at sea, frontier villages under pressure, and a young republic demanding respect from the world's greatest naval power. It ends in Florida's wetlands, Indian Territory, and the uneasy national memory of expansion. That arc is the real story. The War of 1812 was not only a war between the United States and Britain, it was also a turning point in the struggle for the interior of North America. Native nations tried to defend homelands and political futures. Black refuge communities searched for freedom. Settlers demanded land. Slaveholders demanded security. Soldiers enforced policy. Diplomats converted violence into treaty language. Each episode has shown a different face of power. Detroit showed American overconfidence. Lake Erie and the Thames showed the collapse of Tecumseh's dream. Horseshoe Bend showed how Civil War, alliance, and U.S. force broke Creek power. New Orleans showed victory becoming myth. Florida showed borderland invasion becoming national policy. Removal showed paperwork becoming exile. The Seminole Wars showed that survival could outlast conquest. By the late 1850s, the United States stood larger, stronger, and more divided than ever. The same expansion that many celebrated had deepened the slavery crisis and left a trail of broken treaties. Soon, the country would turn its violence inward during the Civil War. But before that next story begins, this one closes with a quieter image. Not a surrender table, not a parade, not a map colored by officials far away. A small fire in the Florida wetlands. Families nearby. Water reflecting the dawn. A people still present after the Republic had spent decades trying to make them leave. The United States called the policy removal. The ending proves another word mattered just as much. Survival. By the time Billy Bowlegs left Florida in 1858, the United States was nearing another crisis. The question of slavery had followed nearly every stage of expansion. It had followed cotton into the southeast. It had followed removal into Indian Territory. It had followed the Mexican cession into Congress. It had followed settlers, soldiers, surveyors, judges, and speculators into every argument over the nation's future. The War of 1812 generation had often imagined expansion as proof of national strength. By the late 1850s, expansion had become a mirror showing the nation's deepest fracture. Every new acre raised questions about labor, race, citizenship, sovereignty, and political power. Would slavery move west? Would free labor define the new territories? Would federal authority protect slaveholders, settlers, native nations, or no one reliably? Indian Territory stood inside that coming storm. Removed native nations had rebuilt governments and communities, but they could not escape the sectional crisis. Some native leaders and citizens owned enslaved people. Other native people opposed slavery or lived in communities where black freedom and kinship made the issue far more complicated than outside politicians understood. Black Seminoles and other people of African descent remained especially vulnerable to shifting law and power. When the Civil War came, Indian Territory would become a battlefield of alliance, division, survival, and betrayal. That later story belongs to another series, but the roots run through this one. The same expansion that removed native nations also intensified the conflict over slavery. The same federal government that promised protection often proved unreliable when power shifted. The Seminole Wars, therefore, do not sit apart from the great national crisis. They are part of the road toward it. Removal tried to turn living nations into administrative problems. It reduced homelands to cession lines, communities to emigration rolls, and grief to expense reports. Officials counted people, wagons, rations, miles, payments, and acres. They wrote letters about order and policy. They treated the language of law as if it could make coercion clean. But removal could not control what people remembered. It could not erase the meaning of rivers, graves, fields, council fires, hunting grounds, towns, and paths. It could not prevent new communities from forming in exile. It could not stop stories from traveling with families. It could not make the children of survivors forget that their ancestors had endured something the government preferred to call policy. In Florida, removal failed in an even more direct way. Seminole people remained on the land itself. They adapted to smaller numbers, harsher conditions, and constant pressure, but they remained. That fact turned survival into a political statement before it ever became a slogan. It proved that even overwhelming power had limits. The United States succeeded in taking vast lands. It succeeded in removing thousands. It succeeded in expanding plantations, states, roads, and markets. Those facts are real, but they are not the whole truth. The whole truth also includes the people who rebuilt in the West, the people who crossed borders searching for freedom, and the people who stayed in Florida when policy said they should not exist there anymore. A final episode has to decide what kind of memory it leaves behind. The easiest memory would be a straight line. The United States fights, expands, removes, and wins. That version is simple, but it is too small for the truth. It leaves out native strategy, black freedom struggles, political division, broken promises, and the strange way defeat and survival can exist in the same story. A better memory is harder. It admits that American soldiers sometimes fought with courage while also serving unjust policies. It admits that native nations were not passive victims, but political communities making choices under terrible pressure. It admits that black Seminoles were not side characters, but central actors in a borderland world where freedom itself was contested. It admits that treaties can be legal documents and moral failures at the same time. This memory also changes how the War of 1812 looks. The war was not only impressment, Canada, Washington burning, and New Orleans. It was also Tecumseh's last effort to build a native confederacy. It was the Creek War. It was the collapse of British support for native homelands. It was the rise of Jackson. It was Florida. It was removal. It was the long pressure that continued after the official war ended. In that sense, the War of 1812 did not simply make the United States feel independent. It helped make the United States more powerful on the continent. And power always leaves evidence in the lives of the people who had to face it. Imagine the final map of this series. In the north, the Great Lakes hold the memory of Detroit, Lake Erie, and the Thames. Tecumseh's dream of a united native barrier has fallen, but the reason he fought remains understandable. Without unity, the pressure of settlement would keep coming. In the south, Horseshoe Bend marks the breaking of Creek power and the rise of Jackson's military reputation. New Orleans marks the victory that Americans turned into national myth. Florida marks the place where that myth became policy, where the defender of the Republic became the invader of a borderland. Farther west, Indian Territory holds the communities forced to rebuild after removal. Some survived by adapting to new political forms. Some carried divisions that removal had deepened. Some fought to protect freedom in a world where law could be used against them. And in southern Florida, the water still reflects the sky. That is where this series ends. Not because the story ended there, but because the image tells the truth better than a proclamation. A small community remains. A cooking fire burns low. A canoe rests near the grass. The soldiers have withdrawn for now. The maps have changed. The wounds remain. But so does life. The War of 1812 began with a republic demanding respect. Its aftermath asks a harder question. What did that republic do with the power it gained? The answer is written across treaties, battlefields, removals, rivers, roads, and remembered names. It is also written in survival,